am Salita Griffin, Chief Senior ADA assigned to the Major Case Unit at the Fulton County DA's office. And along with my esteemed colleagues, Mr. Clint Rucker, Ms. Kara Convery, Mr. Adam Abadi, and Ms. Siri Elamjarou, it is an honor to represent Diane McIver, the citizens of Fulton County, and the state of Georgia in the prosecution of this case. The defendant in this case is charged with 7 counts in the indictment. Counts 1 through 4 encompass the murder of Diane McIver. And counts 5 through 7 are about the influencing of witnesses to cover up what he did to her. Now, this is a case about maintaining an image of wealth and power that the defendant created for himself and the lengths that he went through to keep it. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background about the relationship between Diane McIver and the defendant. Now, they were married in 2005, and this was the second marriage for both of them. And they were both successful in their own right, and they decided to keep their finances separate. The defendant was a partner at Fisher & Phillips, which is a large law firm with many offices across the United States. And he had been there for 40 years and was making a nice living for himself. The defendant was politically influential. He sat on a lot of boards and committees and was very active within the community of Atlanta and Putnam County. Diane McIver started as a bookkeeper at Corey Company, and she worked her way up to become the president and CEO of U.S. Enterprises. And you will hear from witnesses that Diane was a shrewd businesswoman, and her knowledge and expertise propelled U.S. Enterprises into a multi-million-dollar company. And in addition to her role at U.S. Enterprises, she owned 3 other companies: Clay Management, DRS Investments, and Diane Smith Interiors. And at the time of their marriage, she was worth $12 million. Diane was very career-driven, and she never had any kids. But she had a godson named Austin that she loved dearly. And she was a very active part of his life from the minute that he was born. The McIvers had it all. They had this lavish condo up in Buckhead, decked out with the most expensive and extravagant things that Diane could find. And they had this sprawling ranch out in Putnam County. It sat on over 60 well-manicured acres of land. It had a guest house, a saloon, horses and cows. It was beautiful. It was picture perfect. The McIvers had the storybook life. And you'll hear from witnesses that they never argued, that they never saw them argue, that they thought that everything was okay. But things weren't as they seemed. And on September 25th, 2016, the day that the defendant shot his wife in the back, his life was spinning out of control. The partnership that he had in 2005 at Fisher & Phillips was gone. He lost his partnership in 2014 and was planning on retiring in December of 2017. And over the 3-year period, his salary dropped 54%. But what the defendant did is he attempted to maintain the same lifestyle with the same expenses and less money. Now, I said earlier that the McIvers kept their finances separate. And the evidence will show that Diane McIver was responsible for taking care of everything in Atlanta. She took care of the expenses for the condo, the utilities, the association fees, everything that dealt with Atlanta. That was Diane McIver's responsibility. And the defendant was responsible for taking care of the ranch out in Putnam County, including feeding the horses, the cows, the utilities, paying Javier, their ranch hands. All of those expenses were his. and they were running about $20,000 per month. He had become dependent upon Diane. And over the 3-year period from 2013 to 2016, our financial expert, Mr. Dean Driscoll, will testify that he received $198,000 from Diane McIver. In addition to the $198,000 that he received from her, she gave him a loan for $350,000 in 2011. This wasn't a, hey, you can pay me back whenever you get the money. This was an actual loan with a promissory note. And the loan was secured by the ranch out in Putnam County. And based on his financial condition, the defendant would not be able to repay this loan. In fact, the evidence will show that in 2011, when she gave him the loan, it was due in 2014, and he hadn't paid it. So she renewed it so that it would be due in December of 2017. And the evidence will show that over that period, he made interest-only payments and never paid any money on the principal. Diane had told Ann Schwall, the mother of Austin, that she was going to leave the ranch to her godson. And Diane loved Austin so much, she would never draft a will without Austin being included in it. And the evidence will show, we will have Mr. Carlton Morrison, expert in real estate, testify that unless Diane McIver foreclosed on the ranch and took control of it, she couldn't leave the ranch to Austin. The evidence will show that Diane could take control of the ranch by foreclosing on it if the defendant did not pay. The defendant did have a pension, and our expert would testify that based upon his spending habits, it would be depleted in 2 years after he retired. And in addition to that, without the money from Diane that he was receiving every month, on the time of her death, the defendant wouldn't even have $1. As a matter of fact, without Diane's money, on the day that she died, his account would have been negative over $5,000. You're going to hear that when she drafted the will in 2016, the ranch would go to the defendant. If she foreclosed on the ranch, it was her intent for the ranch to go to Austin. And you're going to hear in the days after Diane was shot, and the defendant goes to talk to 2 homicide detectives at APD. And without any prompting, he tells them, I like to be in control. And on September 25th, 2016, Diane was making all of the money. Diane owned the 2 condos in Buckhead. Diane could take the ranch. This ranch, according to the witnesses, that was his pride and joy. This ranch that he would go to every weekend, that he would host parties at, that he would go shooting at, Diane could take from him. On Diane's death, he went from negative $5,000 to over $1.1 million cash instantly. And he was the executor and one of the beneficiaries of Diane's $7 million estate. The easiest way for him to gain control was to kill Diane. And on Sunday, September 25th, 2016, the evidence will show that that is just what he did. The day started off in Putnam County, and they went golfing out at Reynolds Plantation. And it was Diane McIver, the defendant, and one of her co-workers, Mr. Craig Stringer. And Dani Jo Carter, one of Diane's longtime friends, had went and spent the weekend out at the ranch with the couple, but she didn't go golfing. After After they went golfing, they came back to the ranch, picked up Dani Jo Carter, and then they went to have dinner at the Longhorn Steakhouse in Conyers. During the dinner, Diane McIver and the defendant had something to drink, so Dani Jo Carter was driving the truck. They were in a huge white Ford Expedition, and Dani Jo was driving. Diane McIver was in the front passenger seat, and the defendant was seated right behind her. And as they're taking 20, going towards Atlanta, as they approach the downtown connector to go 75, 85 north to head to Buckhead, traffic stops. And not wanting to sit in traffic, Dani Jo Carter takes the first exit that she could. And that would be the exit off of 75, 85 at Edgewood Avenue. Once she takes that exit, she makes a left onto Edgewood Avenue, goes about 3 blocks, and then she makes a right on Piedmont. Dani Jo Carter will testify that she really wasn't paying any attention to the defendant. And after they exited on the highway, he asked for his gun. And Diane McIver opened the console and picked up a gun that was in a plastic Publix bag, handed it to the defendant, not knowing that that would be the weapon that ended her life. She says Dani Jo Carter would testify that as they're heading down Piedmont, her and Diane are talking, and she's not really paying any attention to the defendant. She'll testify that she remembers crossing over Ponce, she remembers going straight over to 10th Street, and she remembers that either at 12th Street or 14th Street, as she's sitting at a red light, she hears a gunshot. Diane says, "Tex, what did you do?" She looks back and she sees the defendant sitting in the back. She sees a puff of smoke, and she sees him in the back with his gun in a plastic bag, and he's moving it around. And then she looks back over at Diane, and she says Diane is writhing in pain. And she says, "Tex, I think you shot me." And then she keeps moving around, and then she loses consciousness. Dani Jo is panicking. She is freaked out. She had never been in a situation like this before. And in her mind, she's thinking that Piedmont would be the closest hospital to take Diane McIver to. But she can't remember how to get there from where she is. So the defendant tells her, "Let's go to Emory." And she'll testify that she says, "I don't know how to get there either." And he says, "I'll give you directions." So she presses the gas, starts honking the horn because there are cars in front of her, trying to get around. And she's driving as fast as she could. She goes past Ansley Mall, makes that right on Morningside, and she's going down that road, zooming, running stop signs, running red lights. And the Morningside area is a two-way street. And it was dark. And she was trying to do the best that she could for Diane. Now, the time that it took to get them to Emory, due to discrepancies in the cameras, it will not be precise. But what we do have is that Dani Jo remembers is that it took 10 to 15 minutes for them to get to Emory University Hospital on Clifton. And another thing that she remembers is that as they're driving back there on Morningside, it turns to East Rock Springs Road, and they're getting closer to Emory. They're approaching a roundabout, and she's driving as fast as she could. And she says the defendant comes up to her, and he tells her, "Slow down. Slow down. There may be women walking their babies in baby carriages at 10 o'clock at night. She'll tell you that she pays them no mind, and she keeps right on to Emory Hospital. And they get there, and you'll see that they come up to the valet, and at some point the defendant gets out of the truck, and you'll see him walking casually up to the entryway. And you'll hear testimony that he says, gunshot wound. And ladies and gentlemen, somehow the defendant wants you to believe that the death of Diane McIver was an accident. But ladies and gentlemen, this was no accident at all. And the evidence will show that this was indeed murder. All of the events on September 25th, 2016 by the defendant were planned, intentional, and calculated. And we'll start from putting the gun in the plastic bag. Our expert will testify that the result of putting a gun in a plastic bag and shooting it prevents gunshot residue from getting on your hands and clothes. In addition to putting the gun in a plastic bag, 8 hours before the murder, the defendant asked Tanner McKinney to take Dani Jo Carter back to Atlanta. Now, Tanner McKinney and Samantha Watson are two young adults that come out to the ranch on a couple of Sundays out of the month in order to groom the horses and to walk them or to ride them. Tanner will testify that he lives in Athens. And he'll testify that he remembers the defendant asking him this because he knew that Dani Jo Carter lived in Atlanta. So he was confused by the request of the defendant to take Dani Jo to the opposite side of where he lived. In addition to that, our expert, Michael Knox, who is a crime scene reconstructionist and an expert in ballistics and firearms, recreated this crime scene. He took measurements, photos, and he recreated the circumstances of that night. And based upon the trajectory of the bullet and the injuries to Diane, he concluded that the gun was aimed at her back. It wasn't on her lap, it didn't accidentally discharge, it was aimed right at her back. The gun that was used, the .38 revolver, was in perfect working condition. It was tested by the GBI and Michael Knox. They fired it, and they did other testing on it to determine that it had no hair trigger. In double action, it required 12 pounds of trigger pull for it to fire. And in single action, it was 2.5 pounds. Michael Knox determined that the revolver could not be fired accidentally, that the defendant had to intentionally pull the trigger, and it couldn't just go off. During a search of the condos in Atlanta and the condos in Atlanta and the ranch out in Putnam County, 44 guns were seized. Some of them belonged to Diane, but a majority of the guns belonged to the defendant. And there were handgun seized, including revolvers and semi-automatics, rifles, shotguns, and a trick or a poker gun. And Tanner McKinney and Samantha Watson will also testify about how the defendant demonstrated to them how to use that gun. And what they'll testify about is that he showed them the gun after a tour of the ranch. And he told them that in order to fire the gun, you had to know all of the special steps to get it to fire. And that he was the only one that can operate the gun, and he showed them how to do it. The defendant had a makeshift firing range at the ranch. It was a huge mound of dirt back in the back. And you will hear witnesses testify that he would go back there and shoot all the time. And he lectured others about gun safety. He would take Austin back there and shoot, and a number of other friends. And they will testify that over and over again, he would lecture them about gun safety. And you'll also hear Dani Jo Carter tell you about a time when Defendant threw a water bottle up in the air, shot it 2 times before it hit the ground. In addition to the gun being in perfect working condition, at the time of the incident, there was no 911 call. The defendant was seated in the back seat, and right beside him, within arm's reach, was his cell phone. And then right beside that on the seat, in her purse, was Diane's cell phone. And right beside that, also within arm's reach, was Dani Jo Carter's purse. And in her purse was her cell phone. And the evidence will show that none of these phones called 911 on that night. Once the defendant got to Emory, people started asking questions. And the nurses and the staff wanted to know what happened to Diane McIver. And you will hear that over the course of time, the defendant gives 6 different versions of what happened to Diane McIver in the car that night. You'll hear from 3 doctors and about 8 nurses from Emory University Hospital. And none of them knew anything about Diane McIver or the defendant or Dani Jo Carter. You'll hear from Dr. Celine Shabler. She's an emergency room doctor. And you'll hear that on that night, when Diane McIver came in, she was actually getting off of work as the attending physician in the emergency room. And Dr. Suzanne Hardy was taking over. But since Emory University Hospital rarely deals with gunshot wounds, she decided to stay and help. So as Dr. Hardy was working on Diane McIver, she was doing little things for her. Like she went and ordered labs and did things like that. Would come back and get updates for the defendant. So one time after she went to talk to Dr. Hardy and asked her how was Diane McIver, and she told her that they were working on her and to go see how the defendant was doing. So she walks to the family consult room, and the defendant is sitting in there alone. And they're talking, and she asks him what happened. And what he tells her is that they were driving in a bad neighborhood, and Diane asked for the gun. And she reached in a console and got it. And then she took the gun, and she put it behind her back. And as they were driving, it went off. And that's how she got shot in the back. Then he told another nurse that as he was cleaning his gun in the bathroom, it went off and shot Diane in the back. And on the same night, he told another nurse that the gun went off while he was holding it in the back seat, and that's how Diane was shot. You're going to hear from Dr. Suzanne Hardy, who was the treating physician of Diane McIver. And as she's working on Diane, she's trying to figure out what happened. Because at this time, she saw 2 holes in Diane. One in the front and one in the back. And she was trying to determine, was it 1 gunshot wound or was it 2? So she asked Diane what happened. And Diane says I was holding it behind my back when the gun went off. Dr. Hardy will testify that she thought this sounded odd, so she asked her again, "You were holding the gun?" And then Diane says, "He was holding it behind my back." Then about 30 seconds pass, and Diane states it was an accident. Dr. Hardy continues to work on Diane and continues to try to save her life. And as time passes, she knows that Diane isn't doing so well and that she might not survive. And she'll testify that Diane looked at her and was like, "I'm dying." And not wanting to tell her the truth, what she did was she said, "We're doing the best we can. You're getting the best care possible. But at this point, I'm going to need to intubate you." And to intubate is to put a tube down her throat. And she was like, "After I put this down your throat, you won't be able to speak." And what she does is she asks Diane a question. She asks Diane, "Do you want to see your husband?" And Diane says, "No." While the defendant was telling all of these stories and trying to change the narrative of what really happened, he had one big problem, and that was Dani Jo Carter. And the evidence is going to show that after they arrived at Emory, what he did was he told Dani Jo, "These situations can get a little bit crazy. So why don't you tell the police that you were not in the SUV tonight and that you just arrived at the hospital sometime later?" And Dani Jo told him, "I'm not doing that. I'm not going to say that because that's not true." And in addition to trying to get her to lie at the hospital, he also pressured her to hold a press conference to proclaim his innocence. And she didn't want to do that either. And what he did was he sent a car to her house to pick her up. And what Dani Jo had done is her and her husband, Tom Carter, left. And they went to the home of Dale Cardwell. And some of you may know who that is. He's a TV personality. He reviews businesses. And they went to his home. And he'll testify that when they got there, Dani Jo was upset. And when the defendant couldn't get a hold of Dani Jo, he repeatedly started calling Tom Carter. He's calling and calling and calling and calling. He's blowing up his phone. And he leaves 3 messages. And one of the messages, he tells Tom to tell Dani Jo to stop saying what she's saying, because it could end him up in jail. And what he tells him is, after you listen to this message, delete this message. And you'll hear it. In addition to trying to get Dani Jo to do this press conference, he also called his longtime friend, Mr. William Bill Crane, who's a TV personality, talks about political issues on TV. And they have been friends for about 33 years. So he calls him to be his public relations specialist for this issue. And so what he does is, he wants to get his side of the story out to the media, because at this time, the media is starting to speculate about what happened. And so what he tells Bill Crane is that as they're exiting at Edgewood, and they turn under Edgewood, and they're going under the overpass, He asked for his gun because he believes that the truck may be attacked by either some Black Lives Matters protesters or some homeless people. And he says that's why he asked for his gun. And then once they got into Piedmont, or a safer area, he dozed off and went to sleep. And then as they were going along, they hit a bump, and the gun went off. And that's how Diane got shot in the back. So Bill Crane will testify that he wrote the story down, sent the version over to the defendant, said, is this all right? Is this what you want me to release? And he got the okay. And then what Mr. Crane did was start distributing it out to media outlets. And once the story got to the media, there was a big backlash about it. And the defendant's attorney at the time, Mr. Steve Maples, and the defendant started calling Bill Crane and asking him to retract the story. They asked him to say that he misrepresented what the defendant said, and that the defendant had never actually said that. And he refused to lie for the defendant. And as a matter of fact, the day before he gave the statement to Bill Crane, he had went down to talk to two APD homicide detectives. And when he gave them a version of events, he said that he asked for the gun because they were in a bad neighborhood, and then he fell asleep. He was in a twilight type of zone when he woke up, and then the gun just went off. And never in that version did he say anything about Black Lives Matter or a bump. After Diane McIver died, less than a week after she died, the defendant began to inventory all of her belongings. Her jewelry, her clothes, her hats, shoes, everything that she had, he began to inventory it so that he could sell it. And what the defendant told media outlets and journalists is that he was doing this in order to satisfy the bequeaths in her will. And he had an estate sale and an auction and raised over $187,000. And the evidence will show that to this date, not one of those bequeaths have been paid. In Diane's will, she desired to be cremated. And you hear evidence that after her autopsy on September 26th, she was transferred to Phoenix Funeral Services to be cremated. And that she was cremated on September 29th. After she's cremated, Miss Wendy Edson, the owner of the crematory, calls the defendant and says, hey, you could come and pick up your wife. He doesn't show. She calls back and says, hey, you can pick up your wife. And what he tells her is that he has to wait for the estate to start being probated so that her estate could pay for her cremation. And so another week passes, and another week. And on October 28th, Diane McIver is still down at the crematory. And one of her friends from a long time ago, Miss Kathy Johansson, learned that Diane was down there, and she paid for it anonymously. And all she asked for was one small memento of Diane. And it wasn't a $5,000 fee. It wasn't a $4,000 fee. It was $1,600 that she paid to get the remains. And it doesn't stop there, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. When all of this other stuff that he was trying to do didn't work, what he did was, after he fired Bill Crane for not retracting the story, he hired Mr. Jeff Dickerson. Now, Mr. Jeff Dickerson is also a public relations specialist. And he's been in the business for a long time. You all may know him from seeing him on Sundays as part of the Georgia gang. And what you will learn is that Mr. Dickerson was a longtime friend of my boss, Mr. Paul Howard, over 20 years. And what he'll testify to is that after he was hired by the defendant, he was called down to his lawyer's office. And the defendant and his lawyer were sitting at a table. Then the lawyer gets up to leave. And it's just the defendant and Mr. Dickerson. And what he tells Mr. Dickerson is, you can get this case dismissed. You can get this case dismissed. And if you do, there's a large bonus in it for you. And I won't mind if you share it with the DA. Now, ladies and gentlemen, at the close of all of the state's evidence, Mrs. Kara Convery will get up here, followed by Mr. Clint Rucker, and they'll perform closing arguments. And what the state will ask you to do is to return a verdict. And the only verdict that speaks the truth in this case is a verdict of guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Griffin.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amanda Clark-Palmer. We just spent, I think, maybe 30 or 40 minutes listening to the state tell you all their theories and their reasons why they think Mr. McIver intentionally shot Diane McIver. And I want to tell you that you can just set all of that aside. There's really one thing that you need to know about Tex McIver and Diane McIver to know that he did not intentionally shoot his wife, and that is that he loved her. Truly loved her, deeply loved her, and she loved him back. You are going to hear from multiple witnesses that they had a relationship that people were envious of, that they seemed like lovebirds even after 10 years of marriage, that Tex adored Diane, that she loved him, and that they were clearly proud to be married to each other. And that's why he didn't intentionally shoot her. Okay, so there are some facts that we don't dispute in this case. Actually, maybe quite a few. One fact you are not going to have to decide is, did Tex shoot Diane? Yes, he did. We are not telling you that the gun was sitting on the seat next to him and it accidentally went off. We are not telling you that the gun malfunctioned. No one is going to ask you to decide who was holding the gun when it went off. It was Tex. That's not a dispute, so don't worry about that. The question you have to decide, was it intentional? And the evidence is going to show it was not. Nothing the state will present to you will prove that this was not an accident. So let me start by kind of going through the timeline of September 25th. And again, this is an area where probably we don't have a lot of disagreement with the state. Dani Jo Carter and Diane and Tex drove out to their ranch in Piedmont, Georgia, which is near Waco County. on Friday, September 23rd. They all went out there together. They had a wonderful weekend. They had great weather on the afternoon, the day in the afternoon of Sunday, September 25th. Tex and Diane played golf. They had a great round of golf. I think Diane beat Tex. She was an excellent golfer. Dani Jo was riding horses. And after they got done playing golf, it was kind of in the late afternoon, evening, and that was when it was time to head back to Atlanta. So they leave the ranch, they stop off at the Longhorn in Conyers, where they meet Craig Stringer, who is a co-worker or colleague of Diane. I believe he had also been playing golf with them earlier that day. He meets them at the Longhorn restaurant, where guests, they share dinner, and by the time they leave, I think you'll hear that it was maybe approximately 8:30 at night on Sunday when they left. So they start driving back to Atlanta. The state showed you part of the route that they used to drive back to Atlanta. Again, a fact that's not a dispute. They go on I-20, and when they get to the connector, they hit a traffic jam. There was some construction going on the interstate, so traffic was really backed up. At this point in time, Tex has fallen asleep in the backseat of the car. He fell asleep on the ride from Longhorn into the city. And so Diane is the one who tells Dani Jo to get off the interstate. Diane is familiar with that area down there. She knows how to use the surface streets to get from the Edgewood exit area back up to their condo in Buckhead. So she is giving Dani Jo the directions. They get off at the Edgewood exit, as I say, and at that point in time, Tex wakes up and he looks around. He says, "Girls, I think this is a bad idea," or "I think this is a bad area," something like that. And he says something to the effect of, "Darling, why don't you hand me my gun?" And as the state said, Diane reaches into the center console. The gun is already in the plastic bag. Mr. McIver doesn't put the gun in the bag. That's how it was stored in the vehicle. It was stored that way to sort of disguise it in case somebody broke into the car. The thief wouldn't realize that it was a gun, hopefully, and take it. So it was already in the plastic bag. That's how it was stored in the car. Mrs. McIver passes it back to him. He's in the back seat of the car. He's kind of, sitting back there, puts the gun in his lap. He's, maybe slumped down a little bit. And as they start to drive and keep going, he throws his back off, falls back asleep. Now, when Diane McIver and Dani Jo pass the gun back, they don't object. They don't say, "Tex, what are you talking about? You don't need your gun. What do you need that for?" They just hand it back to him. No questions asked. So when they get up to the area of Piedmont Park, as the state said, the gun discharges. At that point in time, and I'll get to this a little bit later in more detail, the gun is in Tex's lap. Okay? It's kind of laying sideways in his lap. Like this, he's falling asleep. When they get back to Piedmont Park, the gun just discharges and goes off. And it takes a second for Dani Jo and Diane to realize what has happened. I think Dani Jo, I expect that she'll tell you at first she thought maybe somebody hit them in the car. She wasn't exactly sure what the sound was. And Diane says, "Tex, what did you do?" And then a few seconds later, maybe even close to a minute later, it was a traumatic situation. Nobody had a stopwatch. So all these estimates of what happened when are really people just kind of reaching back in their memory during this traumatic point in time, trying to say, here's my best recollection of what I think happened. But some time passed, again, seconds, maybe up to a minute, and Diane starts to kind of, I don't know about thrive in pain. I believe that what Dani Jo said is that she kind of starts to slump over, and she kind of starts to lose consciousness. And so Tex is in the back seat, and he reaches forward, and he wraps his arms around Diane. He's holding her head in his hands, talking to her, trying to kind of figure out what's going on. She's shot, as the state says, she's shot in her kind of mid to lower back. There's not a lot of blood. It's not, kind of immediately apparent what her injuries are. There's not, kind of blood pouring out everywhere. You're going to see pictures of what the inside of the SUV looks like. You're going to see pictures of what Mrs. McIver looked like at that time. You see that there's just very little blood. So they're trying to figure out what happened, how serious this injury is. And Dani Jo says to Tex, "Where should I go?" Maybe she was thinking that Piedmont Hospital was closer, but she never said to Tex, "How do I get to Piedmont? We should go to Piedmont." What she says is, "Where should I go?" And Tex tells her to go to Emory Hospital. He's very familiar with Emory Hospital. He had been there recently for some procedure or surgery, and he knows how to get from the Piedmont Park area up to Emory Hospital. So he starts giving her directions as they're going. They rush to Emory Hospital. Dani Jo is driving as fast as she can. It's important to get there quickly, obviously. It's also important to get there, safely, so they don't have a wreck and slow themselves down even further. And as soon as they get to Emory Hospital, I expect that you will see the video from the valet area. You can determine for yourself if Mr. McIver casually walks up to the door of the emergency room hospital, or if he gets out of the car and he's quickly moving, calling out, "Gunshot! Gunshot!" And you see the nurses, and there's some security there who come out and meet them at the car and get Mrs. McIver out of the car and take her inside. And as the state told you, she's treated by Dr. Suzanne Hardy. It takes some time. They try to get her stabilized. She regains consciousness when she's there. Nobody is going to come in here and tell you what Mrs. McIver was thinking at that time. Nobody is going to be able to tell you why she said what she said. But what she says to Dr. Hardy, without any prompting, is it was an accident. Dr. Hardy doesn't ask her, do you think it was an accident? Do you think he did it on purpose? She offers, it was an accident. So the state mentioned to you in their opening the fact that nobody called 911. And that's true. Again, that's another undisputed fact. Dani Jo was driving the car. If she thought to call 911, she didn't tell Tex, "Hey, my phone is back there. Why don't you call 911? Tex didn't call 911. He was giving the turn-by-turn directions to Emory. I don't think you should draw any inference or conclusion from the fact that they didn't call 911. The facts are going to show that they got to the hospital, that Tex knew how to get to as quickly as they could. And what Diane said to Dr. Hardy is exactly what happened. This was a horrible, horrible accident. So that's September 25th. In the days after September 25th, Tex McIver actually calls the Atlanta police and says, "I understand you want to speak with me. I'll come down and make a statement." And he goes down with Steve Maples, which name you heard. That's the lawyer who was representing him at that time. And he talks to Detective Darren Smith. And let me pause here and just address one thing that the state mentioned in their opening. They told you that what Tex said to the detectives was, "I like to be in control." And I want to put that comment in context for you. The question to Mr. McIver was talking about how to get down to the ranch on Friday. The detectives were asking him, "How did you get to the ranch on Friday?" The detective says, "Did you all go down in one vehicle?" Tex says, "Yes, sir." "Okay, that was the expedition." "Correct." Detective Smith, "Okay, did you guys take turns driving down there? Or did some of you drive more than others?" Mr. McIver said, "I think I drove." Detective Smith said, "Okay, you're like me. I like to drive when I go." Tex says, "I like to be in control." That's the context of that statement. He's just talking about when they drove down to the ranch, that was why he was driving. It's not some nefarious statement he made in connection with explaining what happened on September 25th. So that's September 28, 2016. Importantly, Tex McIver tells Detective Smith exactly what happened. He tells them he was holding the gun when it went off. He tells them Dani Jo was driving the car when he went off. The events that I just relayed to you about what happened on September 25th, that is what Tex McIver told the Atlanta Police Department on September 28th. Months later, in December 2016, he is arrested. He is arrested for reckless conduct and involuntary manslaughter. He is not arrested for murder. So let me talk about the forensic and ballistics evidence. Let me talk about what happened when the gun went off, what the trajectory was. Let me talk to you about the gun itself. And again, this is the gun that went off and shot Diane McIver. As the judge explained, it's made safe, so you don't have to worry about it going off now. I can't demonstrate for you what the trigger pull is because of the lock that's through the gun. But what you'll hear about this gun is it kind of has what I would call two modes: single action mode, double action mode. Some of you who are familiar with firearms may know exactly what I'm talking about, but if you don't, there are kind of two ways you can fire this gun. This is the hammer here. I believe that this is called a shrouded hammer. It's not what I was picturing. When I thought of the hammer of the gun, I thought of something maybe kind of like a sort of an old-timey Western movie, where the hammer's sticking up and it's got the little thumb thing that you click back. This is the hammer of the gun right here. You can see it in the back there. And as I said, it's shrouded, so it's kind of hard to see from the side when you're looking at the gun because it doesn't stick out very far. So if you do not cock the hammer on this gun, you can fire it by pulling the trigger. And as the state told you, it takes about 12 pounds of force to pull the trigger when it is in double action mode. When you cock the hammer on the gun and it's in single action mode, it only takes 2 pounds of force, which is almost a hair trigger. It is getting, that amount of force is so low, it is almost to the point where they can't measure it because it's so light. So the gun can go off very easily when it is in single action mode. There's no way to forensically tell you if the gun was in single action mode or double action mode when it was discharged. No expert can come in here and say, yes, I've examined the gun. I can tell you when it was last fired that the hammer was cocked or not cocked. And again, I want to be clear that the evidence will not show that the gun went off magically or by itself. It was in Tex's lap, in his hand, when it was discharged. So when we say accidental, what we mean is that the shooting wasn't intentional. And I think there are kind of 5 key takeaways you'll see from the forensic evidence that will show to you that this was not intentional. First, as I said, the gun was resting on Tex's lap when it was discharged. Second, it was fired from a sideways position. That's what I was demonstrating for you before, that when Tex was kind of, laid back in the car, sort of slumped down, the gun is in his lap in this sideways position. It's not pointed upright. It's not like this. It's not back by his hip. It is in his lap when it is fired. The gun never comes out of the plastic bag. That is one thing that we can say definitively from the forensic evidence. They can tell that it was fired from within the plastic bag. Fourth, the bullet goes through the seat, and I'm going to show you a slide on that in just a second. And fifth, Diane was shot in her lower back, as I said, mid to lower back, kind of this area back here. So the gun wasn't aimed at Diane. It wasn't pointed, armed, outstretched at the back of the seat. It wasn't aimed higher up her back, where you would expect somebody to aim the gun if they intentionally wanted to kill somebody. It wasn't pointed at any of her vital organs up here, her heart or the lungs. It wasn't pointed at her head through the back of the seat. In other words, all these facts show that the discharge of the gun was not intentional, but was accidental. So we looked at the gun already. So here is what's shown in these pictures is the passenger seat of the Expedition. This picture in the bottom left corner with the number 2 on it, that's the back of the seat. You can see that that's where the bullet entered the seat. This picture over here on the right, and I hope you all can see it, shows you that there's a lot of kind of mechanical workings on the inside of the seat. I think those relate to maybe the seat heater or maybe the motorized seat. I don't know. But the point is that this bullet passed through all of that before it came out of the front of the seat, which is that top left corner where the number 3 is. And I'm not trying to be crass or glib about this shooting, but if you were going to intentionally shoot someone because you wanted to kill them, this is
Objection, Your Honor. Argument.
So if you want to share what you think the evidence will show, you're welcome to do that. And then at the end of the proceedings, you're welcome to say, based on this, I think it's shown or failed to show X, Y, or Z.
The evidence is going to show to you that it would be just as likely that this bullet might strike the mechanical workings of the interior of the seat and deflect, maybe come back and hit Mr. McIver, maybe go through the seat but deflect and go off at a different angle, go through the radio, go through the side of the car. The evidence is going to show you that it is not a guarantee or even likely that you would be able to kill somebody in this method. And that's why the shooting was accidental and not intentional. Most importantly, there was a witness who was Diane McIver's best friend. Dani Jo Carter had known Diane McIver for a long time, before Tex McIver met Diane. The evidence will show that it's inconsistent with an intentional killing to shoot Mrs. McIver in front of her best friend. You are also going to hear evidence that Tex has a sleeping disorder. It's called REM behavior disorder. It is abbreviated as RBD. So most of us, when we fall asleep and when we dream, kind of a curtain comes down in our mind. So that if we're dreaming that we're running or jumping or whatever, our body is not physically acting out what we're doing in our dreams. People who have REM behavior disorder do experience physical movement while they're dreaming. They can jab and kick if somebody else happens to be in bed with them, because they have whole body jerks. They can have whole body jerks when they're experiencing a dream and they have REM behavior disorder. Mr. McIver has a well-documented history, going back more than a decade, of having REM behavior disorder. And I expect that you will hear evidence about that. I expect you will also hear about something called confusional arousals. And I'm not going to get too far into the details of that with you, but confusional arousals are also sometimes referred to as sleep drunkenness. It's when somebody is startled awake and they are disoriented as to where they are, and they act in a way that doesn't make sense or is inappropriate, maybe even violent. And most importantly, when somebody has experienced a confusional arousal, they can have amnesia, which means they may not be able to recall what exactly happened when they were woken up from their sleep. So I expect that you will hear evidence about that. So let's talk about finances, because the state spent quite a while talking to you about the finances of Mr. McIver and Mrs. McIver. So Tex is 75 years old today. He was, for a very long time, a lawyer and a partner at Fisher & Phillips. It was always part of the plan as he was getting older that he would retire. And it was also something that happened to him, which happens to many, maybe most lawyers as they get older and they start to slow down in their work, that he switched from something called an equity partner to an income partner. I don't remember exactly the date when that happened, but it was sometime in the years before 2016. So kind of the important takeaway from that is equity partner means generally you're making more. Income partner means you're still making a good salary, but you're not making as much as when you were an equity partner. And so I expect that you are going to hear from witnesses from Fisher & Phillips that it is very normal and usual as lawyers advance in their career and they start to get towards retirement age, that they start to slow down, that they change from an equity partner to an income partner, and eventually retire. I also expect that you will hear that Tex remained an equity partner for much longer in his career than most attorneys usually do. At the time he announced his retirement, which was in 2016, so it's not that he lost his job at the firm or he lost some status at the firm. This was part of a plan of his to retire as he got into his 70s. That he still had a big book of business, which essentially means that he had clients who were sending their business to the firm, generating quite a bit of money for the firm. Those clients were very loyal to him. And this was in 2016. So Tex planned to retire from his firm. We absolutely agree that Diane was making more money than Tex. I think the evidence will show to you that as his income was kind of going down over the years, that hers was either staying the same or going up. And yes, he was relying on her income every month. In part, she was contributing to expenses at the ranch. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ranch in a second. I think the evidence will show that it is inconsistent for Tex to want to cut off that flow of income from Diane McIver, because that was something that they had planned for. And the plan was that they were going to pay off the debts so that as Tex got into retirement and he no longer had that income from his law firm, they wouldn't have any debts to pay and they could live off of that retirement income they had planned for. So before I talk about the ranch, let me kind of tell you briefly about Tex and Diane's relationship. They met in about 2000. They dated for about 5 years before they got married. They both had they had both been divorced before, and the divorces were not amicable. And by the time they got married, they were both older. They were both well established in their careers. They were both financially secure. So when they got married in 2005, the way that they chose to handle their finances was by keeping things separate. And as the state told you, Diane McIver paid for certain expenses, usually the ones related up to the condo in Atlanta. And Mr. McIver had things that he paid for. Doesn't mean that they didn't kind of jointly contribute to things that involved both of them. Mr. McIver had owned the property out in Eatonton before he met Diane. But when he met Diane, right before they got married, she came to love the ranch too. That's what they called it, the ranch. And so she contributed financially to making improvements on the ranch before they got married and after they got married. For example, after they got married, she liked to have the flowers changed out twice a year. So that's something that she would use her money to do. And when they got married, Mr. McIver changed the deed on the property so that instead of it being solely in his name, it was now in both their names with rights of survivorship, which meant that if one of them died, the other one would have the deed to the ranch all by themselves. The same was true for Tex. Tex died, Diane would have the ranch all in her name. Diane died, Tex would have the ranch all in his name. So in 2011, there is this note that is secured by the ranch for $350,000. Tex made payments on the note. Yeah, we agree that you'll see that the note says it's due in either 2013 or 2014, I can't remember. He didn't pay off the note by that point in time, so they renewed the note. They extended its due date out to 2017. And while they had this document that seems businesslike and rather formalistic, don't forget that these two individuals are in a marriage. It's not as if Diane said to Tex, or was going to say to Tex, oh, you're late on your payments for 2 months. I'm going to foreclose the ranch and take it from you. I mean, they were married. They were in a loving relationship. This was something that they worked through together. And the evidence will show you that in 2014, they agreed to extend the note off a little bit farther. One more thing about the loan on the ranch. The loan on the ranch doesn't go away when Diane dies. There's nothing in the document that says if Diane dies, this debt is forgiven and you don't have to repay it. I expect you will hear the evidence that Tex is still making payments on that loan to this day. We don't dispute that both Diane and Tex were contemplating making changes to their will. They both had a will that was drafted and executed in 2006, which was executed either before Austin was born or it was executed at a time when he had just been born. So he hadn't really, he was in their lives, but they hadn't developed that close connection with him that they both developed as Austin got older. So Austin is their godson. They both loved him dearly. It's not as if Austin was only Diane's godson. Both Diane and Tex treated Austin as if he was their own child. They both loved him dearly. They both wanted to provide for him in the event that either one of them died. This is not something that Diane was contemplating doing all by herself. And that's another reason why Tex would not intentionally shoot Diane, because he knows that Diane loves Austin, and Austin loves Diane dearly, and he would never take her away from him. Let me also address something that the state brought up in their opening, which was this auction that happened after Diane passed away, where her belongings were sold to generate money for the estate. I expect the evidence will be that that was done on the advice of a lawyer named Stan Smith, who I expect he will come tell you that he was the one who said we need to hold the auction of these items and we need to do it now. The reason being, there's kind of two reasons that go along with that. One is that in particular the furs are obviously a winter item. So you are more likely to get more money for the furs if you have the auction when it's cold than if you do it in the middle of the summer. The second is that just kind of generally clothes sort of lose their value over time. So you don't want to hold on to clothes and sell them at the next cold season because they may not generate as much money when they're sold. So I expect that you will hear Stan Smith come tell you those two things, as well as tell you that it was his advice to hold the auction when it was held in I believe, January of 2017. And the auction was held because Diane made specific requests in her will. There were people that she identified that she wanted to receive money, people other than Tex McIver. And the money needed to be raised to satisfy those requests. And I am confident we're going to be diving into the details of what was in her will, how much money was raised, what was in her bank accounts. So we will have plenty of detail on that as this trial goes on. And while I am on that point, the state's opening spent a lot of time talking about what Mr. McIver did do or didn't do. And I think the evidence will be that there's not some sort of playbook or set of ways that somebody is supposed to act when their spouse has died suddenly and violently, and probably even worse, that your spouse has died at your own hand. I can't imagine anything more traumatic that could happen to an individual. And if there was a certain way that Mr. McIver was supposed to act, well, I don't know where that's written down. So let me move on now. We step away I've been talking a lot about facts that relate to the first 4 counts of the indictment. So let me transition and talk about the last 3, which are the influencing witness counts. The first one deals with Dani Jo Carter. The count charges that Tex told her essentially to tell the police that she was a family friend. The count alleges that he had this conversation with her on September 26th when they were at the hospital. So Dani Jo Carter is given a couple different statements. She is interviewed by the Atlanta Police Department on September 26th, right after the shooting happens. She doesn't say anything to the detectives about Tex telling her to lie. And first of all, just the idea that Tex would tell her, hey, you should tell the police you're just a family friend, doesn't make any sense at all, given that A, they're on camera when they pull up to Emory Hospital. It's clear that Tex is not driving the car. B, it's clear that there's no way Diane could have been shot in the back by Tex unless he was sitting back there and somebody else was driving the car. So it just doesn't make sense that he would go up to Dani Jo and say, hey, why don't you just tell him, you just showed up and you don't know what happened. But on September 26th, I think the evidence is going to show that she is specifically asked by Detective Smith, did you and Tex have a conversation about what to tell the police or what not to tell the police? He's giving her an opening. He wants to know. She says, Tex said he hated for me to be drugged into this mess. She doesn't say anything about Tex telling her to lie or Tex telling her that she's a family friend. When she's interviewed again on September 27th, she doesn't say, hey, by the way, I forgot to tell you something yesterday. Actually, Tex told me, I needed to lie to you all. She doesn't tell her husband that Tex told her to lie. Tom Carter says that Dani Jo said, Tex said, I hate to see you caught up in this, which is consistent with what she told the police on September 26th. It's only much, much later, and I'm not sure if it was weeks or months later, that she tells the DA, oh, Tex told me that I don't lie. So that count fails. You're going to hear this voicemail to Tom Carter. I put the date of October 4th up there. I may have written that wrong. Maybe that it was on October 6th. Whatever the date is, you'll hear this short voicemail that he left for Tom Carter. But you've got to put it in context with the timeline of events that had happened. Diane shot on September 25th. Dani Jo has already been emailed, interviewed on September 26th and 27th. Importantly, Tex is interviewed on September 28th. So before he ever calls Tom Carter, he has already gone and told the police that A, he shot Diane, and it was an accident, and B, that Dani Jo was driving. So why on earth would he then call Dani Jo through Tommy Lee, her husband, and say, you need to now change your story? He's already told the police exactly what has happened. And by the way, there is nothing that Dani Jo said to the police that hurts Tex. She tells the police this shooting was an accident. She tells the police that Tex and Diane had a wonderful relationship and she was jealous of it. So why on earth would he call her up and say, now you need to change your story? That count fails. So let me talk about Bill Crane briefly. As the state said, Bill Crane is somebody who was sort of a PR spokesperson for Tex in the kind of days and weeks after Diane died. Bill Crane puts out this statement to the media and says, Tex said that there were Black Lives Matter protesters in the area of Edgewood at that exit, and that's why he got the gun out. This statement was not meant to inject any kind of racial bias or racial animosity into this case, but the press latched onto it, sensationalized it, probably to sell some papers. And so Tex started getting a lot of blowback for the Black Lives Matter comment from the community and from friends. Bill Crane will tell you that he was getting a lot of sort of testy communication from Texas law firm. They were telling him things like, you need to take our name off your webpage. So that's the context of this statement. And don't forget that September 26th, what time we're dealing with. On September 23rd, that Friday before Diane died, there was a Black Lives Matter protest at Lenox Mall, right across the street from Tex and Diane's condominium. There had been other reports from all around the country that summer and that year about Black Lives Matter's protests, some of which had gotten violent. But there's two important things to remember about Bill Crane's statement and why this count has got to fail. First, as I said, Bill Crane was the PR spokesperson. There was no reason that Tex would ever think he was interfacing with law enforcement.
Objection, Your Honor.
That's what I think the evidence is going to show.
It's argument, Your Honor.
Okay, I'm just going to remind you to hew to what you think the evidence is going to show rather than arguing whether a count fails.
The evidence is going to show that Bill Crane was not dealing with the Atlanta Police Department, that Tex didn't think Bill Crane was dealing with law enforcement or the DA's office, and that's part of the count. That there's got to be some intent to influence a law enforcement proceeding, and the judge is going to give you instructions. But that's one important thing to remember about that count. The second important thing to remember is that whether or not there were Black Lives Matter protesters has no bearing on the question of whether this was an intentional act. That's the important part of the case. Who was at the exit when they got off doesn't matter. That's the second important thing to remember about this count. It's not a crime, had nothing to do with misleading a witness. So let me finally touch on Jeff Dickerson. Jeff Dickerson comes into the picture kind of later in 2016. Jeff Dickerson is going to tell you that at some point Tex said to him, if you can get the charges dismissed, Tex had been arrested, but there was no indictment at that point in time. But if you can get the charges dismissed or get the DA not to bring an indictment, there's a success fee in it for you. This was not a serious comment. And in fact, it was a stupid comment because it could be easily misinterpreted like it is now. Tex did not mean for Jeff Dickerson to run off and try to bribe Paul Howard. And the evidence is going to show to you that there are a lot of reasons why that's not true. First of all, he doesn't say to Jeff Dickerson, go tell Paul Howard that I'm going to pay you a success fee if you can get the charges dropped, and that you'll share it with Paul Howard. That's not what he says. Second, Tex never followed up with Jeff Dickerson. Hey, have you had that meeting with Paul Howard yet? Did you tell him about the success fee? When are you going to have that meeting? Is something on the calendar yet? None of those conversations ever took place. They never discussed the amount of this supposed success fee. Tex wasn't trying to bribe the DA. He wasn't attempting to commit a crime. Jeff Dickerson, I think the evidence will show, didn't think that Tex actually meant he ought to go bribe the DA because Jeff Dickerson doesn't go tell Tex's lawyers, hey, you know what, your client just told me that I needed to go commit a crime, that I needed to try to bribe the DA. He doesn't go tell Paul Howard, hey, Tex McIver just tried to get me to commit a crime. He doesn't tell anybody about this conversation until some 14 months later. And, most importantly, Jeff Dickerson doesn't quit working for Tex. He continues to be paid about $3,000 a month. That shows he didn't think Tex was seriously intending that Jeff Dickerson go bribe the DA. This some 14 months later, that Jeff Dickerson is having what appears to be a casual lunch between friends with Paul Howard when he is no longer working for Tex McIver, and somehow this comes up. Why Jeff Dickerson mentions it to Paul Howard, I don't know. The thing I know that the evidence will show is that it was not an intentional statement. It was not a serious attempt to bribe the DA. It was a comment that has been misinterpreted. So finally, let me just wrap up by telling you I think the evidence is going to leave you with some key questions that you're not going to be able to answer. And if you can't answer these questions, you can't conclude that Mr. McIver intentionally shot Diane.
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't understand how this is different from the state's last slide that said you must find him guilty.
Okay.
This argument, all of these questions are arguments.
Why don't you just share with the jury what you think the evidence is going to show? You've cast it in the form of questions, and then you can wrap up.
The evidence is going to show that Tex shot Diane accidentally in front of her best friend, and that this is inconsistent with intentionally wanting to shoot and kill Diane. The evidence is going to show that where the gun discharged, they were by Piedmont Park, not somewhere out on 120, not out in Fulton County, where the ranch is, where it's remote and there's no hospital nearby. The evidence is going to show that the gun was held sideways, that it was shot through the plastic bag, as I said, that it was shot through the car seat, which had all the interior mechanical workings, that the evidence will show the bullet could have been deflected or slowed down or come apart. The evidence is going to show that the gun entered Mrs. McIver's back in her lower to middle back. And then finally, the evidence is going to show that Tex was relying on Diane's substantial cash flow and income every month, and there was no financial reason for him to cut that off. The evidence is going to show to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Tex loved Diane and Diane loved Tex, that she was his best friend, and that he would not intentionally kill her. He did not intentionally kill her. He did not murder her, and he is not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clark-Palmer. We're going to take a quick break. This will be our first break, so we'll see how that process works. The breaks are always as long as you need them to be. They may end up longer if we're working through things. We're not working through anything yet because we're just about to start with witnesses. So what we're going to do, I'm going to have Deputy Murphy check to see if sort of a 7-minute-ish break, so we're starting at, it'll be 11:15 on that clock, is enough time. And if it's not, you're not done with what you need to do, you just tell Deputy Murphy and you get more time. But as soon as you are ready, at least for this break, we'll be ready. There'll be times when we're not ready, even though you're done because we're working through emotion or who knows what. If you can step around and gingerly do so, gingerly.